we have Rudy Berger, managing partner of Woodside Capital, and he's going to talk about the flow of venture money and the volume of M&A activity in a number of hot sectors. So, Rudy?
Great.
Thank you.
Good morning. So, quick show of hands, how many of you were able to follow the mathematical equations towards the end of Professor Kanabe's talk? Oh, one or two, okay. So welcome to the Business Insights track, otherwise known as people who are not able to follow those equations, right? Which certainly includes myself. I'm hoping to provide an overview of what's going on from a financial perspective in the computer vision, embedded vision sector over the next 20 minutes. My name's Rudy Berger. As Steve said, I run Woodside Capital. We are an M&A advisory firm, typically working with growth stage, as in smaller companies, and I cover the sensing, embedded vision sector for Woodside Capital. So let's jump in. What I'm hoping to do over the next 20 minutes is address, even perhaps answer, a few questions related to this market. Firstly, how are we segmenting the space, and which ones are going to be the highest growth over the next few years? Looking at the torrent, the flood of venture capital worldwide that has been happening over the last few years into embedded vision companies. Who are the main investors, both corporate and venture, and where is their money going? I'm particularly interested in comparing investment and M&A activity between the US and China. Some pretty interesting trends there. Which segments have seen the most M&A activity, and who are the most active acquirers? And then at some point over the last couple of years, I stopped to ask myself the question, where are all the unicorns in the computer vision, embedded vision space? And there are actually a couple of unicorns. I'll talk about that, but I'll also talk about why I think this sector has not produced more unicorns. And then I'm going to finish up talking in particular about the consumer market and the autonomous vehicle market, automotive market, which are two of the sort of hotter areas at the moment for embedded vision. So at a very high level, I sort of break down the application markets for computer vision as follows. This line here is broadly tracking number of instances, number of cameras using embedded vision. So I suppose over the last 12 months, courtesy of Tesla and Apple in particular, embedded vision technologies have sort of been introduced to the consumer at large. Prior to that, I think the average person in the street probably wouldn't have known what you were talking about. That is now dramatically changed. And just over the last 3 years, about $1.2 billion in the US alone have been invested into vision companies. If we look at it by segment, broken down into hardware, software, services, the growth is expected to look something like this. So, if we look at where we are today, get this thing working. There we go. So you can see about $2.5 billion of revenue from these sectors combined, expected to grow to about 26, 27 billion by 2025. Then I wanted to examine what's going on in the blue, which is the software area here, and sort of broke that down. So if we look at just software, computer vision software by industry, and look again at the sort of 2016 to 25, what was really striking to me is how evenly spread across the large number of sectors are going to see growth in these markets. It was pretty difficult to actually pick out which ones to highlight here. So in particular, what I found interesting is that and these percentages down here are the so-called CAGR, compound annual growth rate. So healthcare, which is barely, is actually a very small piece of the market today, is expected to be one of the fastest growing segments over the next, 7 years. But broadly, the takeaway from here, and probably my entire talk, is just how many market segments, are going to see penetration and growth from embedded vision. And there's no sort of 3 segments that are going to dominate the market for embedded vision. From here, I want to just jump. I think I just have one slide to talk about China versus the US in terms of the investment into vision companies. So, in case it's too small to read, so the solid bars here, blue is the investment in China into computer vision companies, and the orange is the investment into embedded vision companies in the US. And then we see number of deals in China, right? The sort of gray line here, and number of deals in the US here. The growth in basically they're sort of keeping track with one another. The standout here, and I don't have a chart to show this, but the number of patent filings in China relative to applications in security and surveillance is absolutely extraordinary. It's a country with a very large number of IP cameras everywhere, and it's a very hot area for IP in China. A couple of standout companies here from a venture capital standpoint. $460 million raised for MEGV, Chinese startup that developed facial recognition. And then we'll get to a couple of the China-based unicorns in a few minutes. If we look at the more active investors in venture investors, these are all fairly well-known investors in the U.S. I apologize for there's one misprint that I know about in here. Matroid did not raise 668. This is supposed to be 6.6 million, not 668. So apologies for that. But if I just sort of run through a few of these, Doxel, which is one up here, artificial intelligence for the construction industry, construction productivity. Skydio is focused on drones. Aquabyte is farm monitoring. So embedded vision for the aquaculture industry. Mapillary, street level imaging. Cobot, intelligent robot manipulation. And throughout this exercise of putting this deck together, I was time and time again struck by the incredible diversity of markets in which embedded vision is starting to emerge, get funded, and in some cases, companies get acquired. So these are the venture investors. The other side to this story is looking at the corporate investors. And there again we see both the companies from the autonomous vehicle and just automotive industry. We also see a lot of activity from the semiconductor industry and consumer electronics. So these guys are not only acquiring companies at a pretty spectacular rate, but also investing. Of course, the granddaddy from a funds raised, I believe at this point over $2 billion is Magic Leap. Who in here has actually seen a Magic Leap system and has had a chance to play with one? All right, one person, yeah. So at some point, I suppose we will all get to see them. I'm told it's amazing, but I personally haven't had a chance to see this. I mean, I would say that from an industry standpoint, both augmented reality and virtual reality, which were expected to be, by this time, significant drivers of revenue for the embedded vision market, have so far disappointed. Vision, because of course in virtual reality, it's important to see your hands in front of your face and spatial awareness. But I think it was 2016 was supposed to be the big transition year. Just hasn't materialized yet. Point of this slide is really again just to show the the activity and enthusiasm which the corporate investors are investing, even starting to invest into semiconductor companies. I would say that while there's been complete dearth of funding into semiconductor companies, particularly from VCs, but also from corporate venture, AI and embedded vision is starting to drive a little bit of a resurgence in that. If we look at the top public company acquirers, household names, who's actually snapping up the most companies in the embedded vision space, starting with Alphabet's acquisition of Viewdle up in the top left-hand corner. Some notable ones to sort of call out here. Firstly, some of you may be aware, probably most not, Apple acquires a couple of hundred companies a year, but you will only read about 4 or 5 of them. Most of them simply just don't make the news. Apple being so large is not required to announce them. PrimeSense obviously took place 5 years ago, and we're starting to see some of that, the technology acquired from PrimeSense in the iPhone 10. I'll probably talk about that a little bit later. What's interesting to me in what Apple's doing with embedded vision is there was a tremendous amount of speculation before the iPhone 10 was announced as to what vision technologies were going to be in the phone. And now that came out, everybody sees that, at least in terms of front side vision, that for the time being focused on Face ID, that has caused pretty much all of the smartphone manufacturers to be chasing depth sensing vision technologies. The technology that Apple's put in their phone is very expensive, so now looking for cheaper versions of that. And then the other big question is, what are the applications, what are the technologies to drive the world-facing depth sensing? And even if we can do that, what's going to be the killer application there? You know, is it games? Is it, you know, some other form of mixed reality? So I don't think anybody's really figured that out yet. Cognex, of course, one of the granddaddies in you know, computer vision for commercial industrial applications. Intel made one of the, I think it was the second largest acquisitions they've ever made. This $15.3 billion acquisition of Mobileye. You know, this was basically to ensure that they had a seat at the table in the, you know, in this rapidly growing market of, you know, semi-autonomous and autonomous vehicles. Movidius, you know, many of you will be aware of, you know, Movidius, an Irish semiconductor company. We, you know, worked with them. Fantastic result for their shareholders, getting acquired for almost $400 million. And then, of course, Qualcomm is moving beyond their bread and butter smartphone market and, you know, very aggressively moving into embedded vision, not only in, you know, automotive, but consumer products. Looking at some sort of notable recent acquisition, you know, can see here a number, I think most of these, let's see. So this is spanning the last, just the last year and a half. Just sort of quickly hitting on a few of these. You know, BriefCam, interesting company, really targeting the security and surveillance space, being able to take, you know, thousands of hours of video and pull out quickly the salient features, you know, meta tagging. In television was a deal we just announced a few weeks ago, acquired by Nortec. What we're starting to see in the in this space is very interesting growth in intelligence moving into the camera itself, so embedded solutions to reduce the number of false positives. You know, I have a camera at home that I bought a couple of years ago, and it simply sends me alerts anytime anything happens in my house. I can't tell the difference between, you know, a branch blowing on a tree, my dog running across, you know, something falling off a shelf, or an intruder. So of course what we all want to know is not just something happened, but what happened, and get a text message telling us what happened, not, you know, 15 seconds of video, something happened, look at the video. So, you know, this is a hot area. We're starting to see the manufacturers of these, what started as sort of smart speakers, the Echo type devices, take on eyes as well as ears to be able to have a sense of, you know, not just somebody's talking at me, but, you know, who's talking at me in an environmental sense. So we expect that to be a hot area. AMS, Austrian Microsystems, has been one of the most aggressive acquirers of embedded vision technologies. Key Lemon, a company out of Switzerland, face recognition, Face ID. Many of you will have seen that Apple acquired Envisage last year. Envisage was a company that has a quantum film coating for light sensors to enable them to see into the infrared. Obviously, infrared being an important component of a lot of depth imaging systems, and so forth. I can, you know, answer questions about more of these if you want. You know, just one more slide here. We see, you know, Facebook making, you know, making a foray into embedded vision. Baidu from China making Valeo from the automotive side bought Gestagon. last year. Again, we talked about Intel and Mobileye. Another home security company bought Object Video, one of the sort of the granddaddies in this space, last year. And of course, eBay acquired Corrigon out of Israel last year. So a lot of activities. I mean, frankly, just picking which ones to show on these last two slides was quite challenging. What's that mean? 5 minutes, right? Okay. So, here's a few more. Again, I can answer questions about these. Let me get to the unicorns question. So I pulled data on the unicorns, which I imagine all of you know at this point. A unicorn is defined as a private company and they're not all technology, most of them are. A private company that's worth over $1 billion. And then we've now got decacorns, which are worth over $10 billion. So this is how they're segmented by, the top, I don't know, what is this, 6 or 7 market segments. So the majority of them are in sort of the e-commerce area. We've got 27 in fintech, 27 in internet services, software and services, and so on. There is actually no segment that I could create here for vision companies. However, there are actually 2 unicorns in the embedded vision space. Interestingly, both Chinese, SenseTime and Yitu. I think that the reason for, first of all, the reason for these 2 companies in particular, I couldn't find, is there anybody from SenseTime and Yitu in the audience? I want to make sure I don't offend anybody, right? In looking at their websites and thinking about what I know of these companies, there is nothing in the IP of these companies that would justify the sort of valuations that these companies have been able to raise money at. And in fact, when we've met with companies that have perhaps raised their initial round in China and then come to the US, it creates a real problem for them because the valuation metrics between China and the US is so different. Nonetheless, these 2 companies, because they were, I think in particular because they were raising money in China, have been able to raise money at valuations that make them both unicorns. The reasons, and again, this is just my opinion, why are there so few unicorns in the embedded vision space? I mean, on some level, I'm starting to see vision as a feature rather than a category. It is becoming, embedded vision is becoming so ubiquitous across so many different markets that it is no longer a category unto itself. I tried to think of other companies in the perhaps human machine interface space that were perhaps comparable in some way to vision companies. Thought about Nuance, which is today the unquestioned leader in voice recognition. When they got started, there were a lot of companies in this space. They actually got started as an OCR company, spun out of Xerox. We helped take them public back in the sort of 90s. They actually grew to their current multi-billion-dollar size by a series of roll-ups. They very aggressively went after acquiring other companies and went public, which then accelerated their rate of growth. I would imagine that there will be examples of exactly this in the embedded vision space. Roll-ups probably across a number of different market sectors. I think that the other thing that we're seeing is that we're at a stage of development where many of the large natural buyers, whether they're consumer electronic, automotive companies, security companies are kind of stuck between whether to build it themselves or to acquire a company. They see this rightly as embedded vision technology as absolutely core to the future of the company, and therefore feel like they somehow need to grow it internally rather than buy an outside team. And we see the industry, particularly in the automotive sector, very much in a state of unsure as to whether to try to grow organically or inorganically. So a couple of slides just to sort of talk about market trends to sort of wrap things up. Embedded vision has arrived in the consumer market with a vengeance, driven by smartphones, and these increasingly intelligent home IP cameras. As I mentioned earlier, the industry is sort of currently is scrambling to try to figure out, what is the future of, depth imaging on smartphones. Of course, this is still and likely to be for some time the highest growth area, not highest growth, but certainly the highest volume area for depth imaging. And so, a number of companies here are placing multi-billion-dollar bets. Any of you at Google I/O a week ago or 2 weeks ago? Very interesting presentation. Google's now claiming that they actually don't really need, special cameras, depth cameras, to do depth imaging on a smartphone, because they can, with their cloud technology, look at the picture you've taken and recognize the objects within the picture. And of course, if you know what the object is and you know the resolution of the camera, you can get, and then you know how many pixels the object is. Since they know the physical dimensions of the object, right, they can give you a pretty good estimate of how far away it is. Right? And so they're claiming that they can do depth imaging now with, just based on the, size of their database of real-world objects. TBD. Of course, they were one of the pioneers in this whole area with Tango, and I don't see them, pursuing that on any volume in the market today. I would say that the market for face recognition is getting pretty crowded. At last count, we had 80 companies in our database, and that's now moving on to face analytics, whole body analytics. We're seeing this market for home cameras, growing very rapidly. Seeing companies, to my mind, this is a pretty crowded space. The manufacturers of the IP cameras clearly are seeing this category getting commoditized and are now, seeing the smarts in the camera, as the key differentiator. There's one example here. Netgear is spinning off a whole division, taking them public later this year, to simply commercialize, smart cameras for the home. So this is the way we see the smart home sort of evolving from the apps up at the top here, the services, if you will, devices, device level, the companies that are playing in the processor space today, and then breaking it down still further. If you look at the depth imaging hardware, we break that down by sensor companies, 3D camera module companies, illumination companies, and optical lens companies with their, the size of these numbers here. A lot of this market research we did through our partnership with Yole out of France. In fact, Guillaume is here in the audience, and I'm sure if you have any questions on market sizing and so forth, he'd be happy to talk with you. Guillaume, you want to just put your hand up so people can see you?
We'll need to kind of wrap up pretty quick.
Yep, this is my last slide, I think. So, The second one I want to talk about, because again, we're very active here, number of cameras per car continues to rise. For those of you who own a Tesla S, there are 8 cameras currently, outward-looking cameras in the Tesla S, and that number is only going to rise once they start adding inward-looking cameras. Sensor fusion is becoming increasingly important, and I think that's one of the issues that's going to drive, help drive the question or answer to the question of, are we seeing intelligence move to the edge or towards, all-powerful NVIDIA processors? I personally believe that there may be an opportunity for the vision technologies over the next few years to replace LiDAR. After all, we humans have, 2 vision sensors and a very powerful processor. We do not have LiDAR coming out of our head. I think there is an argument to be made that this is a stopgap technology. And finally, my key takeaways and summary, as we will all see, this technology is permeating a myriad of different industries. It is going to be a very large market, expected to be worth over $25 billion by 2025. The analysts believe that logistics and healthcare are going to be 2 of the largest market segments by dollars in 2025. Since Intel acquired Mobileye and Movidius last year, most of the acquisitions that have taken place have been relatively small. I mean, again, that was a $15.5 billion acquisition, so no surprise there. China is on a tear, investing in and patenting IP for security and surveillance. And, as a serial entrepreneur myself, I've started 5 imaging companies. If I were an entrepreneur today thinking about starting an embedded vision company, I wouldn't worry too much about exactly what technology I was going to use. I think the key to create a valuable company in this space is to find a novel use case that could be transformed by embedded vision and focus on that. It's all about the use case. All right. Do I have time for questions?
No,
not.
I think we're a little bit past time.
Sorry, I used up all my question time.
That was a great talk. Thank you so much.